Okay, good evening. Welcome. Nice to see you. And really, it's a great pleasure for me to be on stage here with my good friends, colleague for, we're not going to say how many years.
Thank you.
Except to say, I joined Columbia only 2 years after you did. In looking at your bio, I realized. It's really great to be here and to be with Lisa Anderson, who is back at Columbia after she had served as president of the American University in Cairo for 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. Your inauguration was supposed to be on February 5th, 2011. I was planning to go, and we all, of course, know what happened during that period. Before being president, she had left Columbia in 2008 to be provost at AUC. And before that, she had been at Columbia at the School of International Public Affairs as dean between 1997 and 2007. But she had already been on the faculty of Columbia. And since 1986, and before she was dean, she was chair of the Department of Political Science and director of Columbia's Middle East Institute, and she held the Shotwell Chair in the Department of Political Science. In addition to Columbia and to AUC, Lisa has taught at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School and the Government and Social Studies departments at Harvard University. So please join me in welcoming Lisa Anderson to the stage.
Delighted to be here.
Lisa is the James D. Shotwell Professor Emerita of International Relations at SIPA at Columbia, where she is now a special lecturer. Really delighted to host Lisa here. We've had a couple of days of really fantastic and dynamic engagements with members of the community, with faculty, with students. And she gave a talk yesterday about the politics of political science, which I'll make some references to over here. So along that career path, your work has focused on a number of areas in this region, but more broadly, state formation in the Middle East and North Africa, regime change and democratization in developing countries, and broadly social science, academic research, and public policy in the United States and around the world. You've had to your credit a number of books, among them The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, 1830 to 1980.
Ask me about the Ottoman Empire.
I will ask you about the Ottoman Empire. And I was very grateful, actually, to Lisa for writing the foreword to my book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly. You wrote Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science, and Public Policy in the 21st Century. I'm still introducing Lisa, even though we welcomed you. There's so much to say. But I mean, a couple of things that I think are really noteworthy over here is that you are a member emerita of the Board of Directors of Human Rights Watch, and you've chaired the board of the Social Science Research Council for a decade, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Council on Foreign Relations. So a lot to her credit. So I thought we'll have a conversation and we'll see where it leads us. I mean, we've talked about maybe I'd love to explore with you higher education, your experience in leadership in higher education, both as as the first female dean at SIPA. I think you were the first female dean, the first female provost, and then...
I actually have a lie about that. I'm the first woman in every job I've ever had.
Wow. I like that. That's great. Yeah. And in SIPA, there is now a female dean, right? But how long do you think it'll be before we see a female president of AUC?
Well, we always say in this domain that it doesn't really count unless there have been two. That is to say, you can do a token appointment and they say, well, we got that done and we're never going to do that again. So it's an open question, I think.
Yeah.
I think and actually, as those of you who follow American higher education may have noticed, things are roiling quite a lot in some of the most notable universities in the United States. And virtually all of the university presidents that are being challenged right now are women. So
Yeah.
I think that is not completely coincidental. It's a very hard job, obviously. And I think the transition to thinking of women as ordinary in that kind of job has yet to completely happen.
So let's talk about universities in the United States and what they're going through. And yesterday, I think you used the word turmoil, and I couldn't agree more. And this happened long before October 7 and everything that's been going on. Universities have come under scrutiny because of financial aid, because of student loans, because of FAT, because of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and right-wing, left-leaning sort of tensions, the bastions of left-leaning cultural institutions in America. But let's get into all of that. But let's, sticking with the theme of presidents and women presidents in particular, the tenure of university presidents in the United States has been shrinking, right? It's one of the worst jobs to have today, is to be president of an American university.
Which is too bad, because it's a very interesting job.
Right? Yes. It used to be a very coveted job. But what has happened since October 7, who has come under attack? McGill at Penn, of course, Claudine Gay, both of them have been forced out. The president of MIT, all of them have been in their positions for a very short period of time. Minouche Shafik, the new female president of Columbia, dodged the bullet by, now, what I know, this is in confidence, is that she said, I'm not going. Find me a good excuse. So she got invited as a result to COP28 and was able, and she's been president only since July, right? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about sort of women coming particularly under attack, their position in the context also of what we have been witnessing on college campuses over the past few months.
Well, I actually think you're right. This has been long in the making, actually. American higher education has been under scrutiny for some time. And I think it's fair to say part of this is ideological and a reflection of growing divisions within the United States politically. But there's also a sort of higher education angle to it, which is for the last 25 years or so, because state funding was declining, that is to say federal funding of research universities and scholarships and so forth, and funding of state university systems by their state. So you see a decline in public funding of higher education. So the response to that was, as you might expect, the collection and empowerment of very wealthy friends of these universities. So you see the boards of trustees becoming increasingly dominated by people who are very wealthy, typically in finance. And what happens when you have a governing board that is composed of people who are private equity investors is that they tend to see the university through that lens. So they see this as, in essence, a troubled asset that they've acquired, and they have to slim down, and they have to take care of, and they have to make, if not, ready for sale, certainly something that they can say is a robust institution by their own lights. Now, obviously, because these institutions are not technically for sale, the proxy for thinking that your bottom line is good is your endowment. The bigger the endowment, the more robust the bottom line. So there's been a lot of effort on the part of universities to cut costs in various ways and to begin to think of the way the university ought to run in very corporate, very business-like terms. To some extent, universities, like almost any large operation, can afford to look at their expenses and whether these are becoming unnecessarily generous. But the problem is that unlike acquiring an airline, for example, where you can say, management is the one who establishes the routes and negotiates with the airports to get gates and so forth and so on. And as one of the trustees that I've interacted with over the last couple decades said to me, the thing about faculty is they're like pilots. They're very specialized, very technically skilled, but they don't know anything about how to run an airline. And I thought to myself, there's something called faculty governance. There's something about the purpose of a university, which is not making money. It just really isn't. And the culture of universities is not the same as the culture of airlines, or even for that matter, health systems and hospitals, which has been another sector in which people have been investing. So I think we've begun to see a real culture clash. In other words, it's not simply the kinds of things that people use to poke universities. It's also a sort of more, what's the purpose? What's the underlying purpose of a university? Education is expensive. Research is expensive. It takes a very long time to show any returns. So your return on investment is very hard to establish. As anybody who's ever been in university, which I assume includes virtually everyone here, it took a long time, and you probably may not even know now exactly what the benefit of your education was. It's not as if your first job is how we know whether it was useful or not. But if you have an ROI kind of frame of mind, then you start saying, well, what are the indicators of success? Employment. Well, there are easy ways to produce employable people. That's not necessarily what an education is for. So there's been this kind of very complicated debate. At the same time, questions about DEI, equity, inclusion, and so forth have bubbled up from a variety of different directions. Black Lives Matter, George Floyd's death was clearly an impulse to say something wrong in this country, which is hard to dispute. The Me Too movement was similarly a sort of, there's something wrong here. So people began to think that maybe part of the solution was using universities as a way to produce the next generation of a more diverse, more equitable, kind of generation of professionals and citizens. But there wasn't, that clash with, are we making any money? Because honestly, that doesn't, you can have a remarkably undiverse university that's very profitable. And it didn't really resonate with a lot of the purposes of this business-like approach. But okay, people would go along with it until it seemed to be sort of counterproductive. So as a result of that sort of tension, you see this whole generation of university presidents retiring more quickly than had been the case before. And a whole generation...
because they felt that the mission was being compromised?
They were tired.
Tired.
Yeah, I wouldn't say if you lined up, the president of Harvard and the president of Columbia, Lee Bollinger, and so you'd line them up, they wouldn't necessarily say all the same thing about why they were leaving, but a generation left.
Okay.
And they left in this context. So this was an opportunity for bringing new blood in, thinking about things differently and so forth. So you saw this very odd, actually, set of appointments of women. Once one university did it, everybody had to do it because you couldn't be. But unfortunately, partly because it happened all at the same time, I think, and partly because trustees are less inclined to see women in those offices as an ordinary fact. So they were still sort of testing out. I remember when I told you I had been the first woman in all of my appointments. Early on in my academic career, I had a new job, and I was told by my supervisor, if you will, that I was an experiment.
The provost at the time told you that?
No, I didn't say it was the provost. But living as an experiment, almost every time I got a new job, I got accustomed to that feeling of knowing I'm an experiment. So all these women were being appointed as experiments.
Yeah.
It's a funny position to be in, I promise you.
When you became dean in 97, were there other female deans?
They were nursing and social work.
Nursing and social work, right. Like, you go to a place like Jordan, if there's a female minister in the cabinet, it's usually social development.
I'm sorry. But a footnote to that. So I'm appointed the president of the American University in Cairo, obviously the first woman in that position. So the American higher ed press, such as it is, made an issue of that. It's interesting. That's something to report on. So there were articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education, so forth and so on, and they said I was the first woman appointed at president of a university in Egypt. There were 2 women university presidents at that time, including Alexandria University. Who cares? Whatever. We don't care about the truth. We care about the... I was horrified. I was insulted on behalf of Egypt. I was insulted on behalf of women. I mean, so there's a little bit of this. You put people in a position of being an experiment,
right,
when they're not even an experiment anymore.
Right. Or tokenism.
Yeah.
Right?
So the tokenism is, and it almost invented. They could have said another woman was appointed university president in Egypt. That would have been fine. That would have been true. Anyway, the point is that there is this sort of, the being an experiment follows you around even when you're not.
So there are 2 vignettes I'd like to pursue with this. One is, so you talked sort of about the corporatization of higher education. And, I've been in it for a long time. I've seen it grow and evolve. What it looked like to me at Columbia, 3, 4, 5 years ago was very different than it did 20 years ago. The question is, who ends up paying the price? Because you did talk about cutting costs, but where were those costs being cut? New buildings were going up, right? A lot of what would be described as sort of catering to certain donor classes. Many of those who occupied the board seats were typically MBAs from the university, graduates from the business school, or lawyers from the law school. So typically you saw new, beautiful business school buildings, new, beautiful law school buildings, but an underinvestment in chemistry labs, as an example.
Actually, your STEM departments probably do okay.
Do what?
Okay.
Yeah.
You're under investing in the School of the Arts.
Well, I was going to get to that. School of the Arts, where financial aid is key. And you remember the article in the Washington Post a couple of years ago that talked about sort of the debt that students who graduate from schools of the arts and School of Social Work in particular have. But at Columbia, they complained a lot about the state of the labs in some of the buildings. And faculty, right? Faculty and faculty of arts and sciences in particular, medical school faculty, professional school faculty get paid very well. And students, right? So it's a corporatization of a certain kind of a certain, it's about maybe growth in certain areas, physical facilities, growth that caters to maybe, clusters, but not necessarily overall. You remember a few years ago when during COVID, universities across the land, faculty salaries were put on hold, hiring was put on hold, benefits were put on hold, but then universities, some Columbia, for example, did well during that period.
Made money. Well, I think, yes, that's all true. And there was a never let a crisis go to waste. Let's make some money and put it in the endowment. Well, people think this is an emergency, which obviously was an emergency, but you could have approached it differently. I think what to me is crucial here is beginning to see students as customers.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why you begin to have, fancy dining halls and so forth and so on is you're competing for customers. Now, in the very elite schools like Columbia, you have lots of applicants who are rejected even though they're perfectly capable of going to Columbia College. But in general, you want to be competitive as attracting lots of applications because your selectivity rate is part of one of those indicators of whether you're successful or not. So the fewer students out of the applicant pool you admit, the better those numbers are and so forth. So that's one side. You begin to see students as customers. On the other side, you begin to see faculty as real employees. Faculty governance is something that none of these administrations / trustees really understand or appreciate. So you begin to see what we have seen across the United States, which is the shrinkage of tenure, because the trouble with tenured faculty is they think they run the place, which of course they used to. They did run the place. That was the point. And you gave them tenure in part so that they would invest in the place for the long run. So you shrink your tenured faculty, you have a larger pool of contingent faculty. Much of the teaching is done by people who are not on a tenure track, so forth and so on. Much less expensive and actually much less sort of difficult to deal with, because those kinds of employees who are sort of employees at will are less likely to say no. So you see it in various different levels.
Right.
You see it in terms of the choices of where you do spend the money. You do spend the money on buildings and things like that. You don't spend the money on the faculty. You do spend the money on student unions or, fancy things like that. You don't actually spend the money on making sure that they don't leave without debt. So instead of a fabulous student union, you could say, we're going to put it in the scholarship fund. You don't.
Right. Which was part of the problems that John Sexton, then president of NYU, was facing and led to a vote of no confidence in him by his faculty.
Lots of people have had votes of no confidence. Yeah.
So let's stay within universities for a few more minutes, but bring it to the current moment again, right? And now, if I follow that line of thinking, which I agree with in terms of corporatization, what we have seen over the past 3 months is that donors, whether they're trustees or not, right, are calling the shots in universities. They're ousting faculty, they're ousting presidents because they're not doing what they want them to do. And they're even intervening in the case of Harvard, for example, unhappy with the selection of the person who's running the task force on anti-Semitism. So with that also, what's happening to, and what's going to happen to freedom of expression? The university is now being controlled really by the donor class. There is incredible silencing and repression of freedom of expression. We're seeing it at the elite universities primarily, but I think we're going to increasingly say it throughout. We feel a little bit fortunate so far at Georgetown, and I don't mean Qatar, but in general. But we say, the other shoe is going to drop at some point. The question is, when does it drop? Where do you see all of that going? That's
well, I actually do think it's a little surprising to me that the trigger for this battle is about Middle East politics. I wouldn't have predicted that, but I would have predicted that there would be some moment where the battle over who's in charge here is joined. So, from the point of view of the trustee groups that we've described, they're in charge. They're supposed to be in charge. They made these investments. And from the point of view of the faculty, no, the faculty are supposed to be in charge. And the faculty are the people who write the codes of academic freedom, uphold the idea of academic freedom, say, for better or for worse, the point of a university is debate, and we're going to debate things that are contentious and difficult and so forth. And if you think of the institution from the point of view of these trustees/donors and so forth, that's not what the point of the university is. It wasn't what they bought into. So this is a really existential battle over the soul of the university. I think as a result of that, we will see this play out for a pretty long time. This is not going to end this semester. I think you're going to see a lot more. You've begun to see faculty sort of pushing back pretty hard, organizing themselves in a way they haven't been organized in years. And so I think, the kind of difficulties that we're having at Columbia or anywhere else are going to roil through the spring. I think a lot of this the substance of the debate will be, what can we say about Palestine? But the debate is, who's in charge here?
Who's in charge here, right? And what's allowed and what's not allowed in terms of...
And who decides what's allowed? Yeah. It's not so much what's allowed, but who decides what's allowed.
Yeah. What about U.S. universities or American universities? Because they're not all U.S. Affiliated universities in the region. You spend time, obviously, in senior leadership at AUC. I know you taught for a year or semester at NYU Abu Dhabi. You're here, and we hope that you'll be coming back and spending more time with us.
Yes. That was an invitation, yes.
Sold. You're very familiar with this, and I know this is something you've thought about, you've written about. And there are different models, right? So AUC, AUB started off as missionary universities, colleges. They don't have a home campus in the United States. AU Sharjah doesn't have a home campus, I don't think, in the United States. Then you have NYU Abu Dhabi, you have Education City with our home campuses back there. How do you compare and contrast how these different models operate, their value, the challenges that they face? Not that there is one model that right. I mean, but what are your observations about them and about the values that they provide?
Well, first of all, again, there's a landscape in which these universities are embedded in the Middle East and North Africa. And it is a landscape that's in some ways resonates with what we were describing in American higher education. It's a global process. The great national universities of the Arab world that were established in, depends on when, obviously, but in the 20th century through, say, the 1960s, were supposed to be vehicles for mobility, for creating a class of leaders that were well-educated for these newly independent countries and all that sort of stuff. Very inspiring in my estimation, but as it turned out, very expensive. Most of them were tuition-free because that was part of the commitment. And just as there's been a sort of corporatization of the university in North America and Europe to some extent, there's been a sort of neoliberal move in higher education in the Middle East. So what you see is, the American University in Cairo was the only non-national government-owned university there from 1919 until 1999, essentially. And then the Egyptian government, and again, this is typical, realized that the national universities were never going to be able to absorb all the demand for university education and weren't necessarily even serving the purposes of what they hoped would be a growing private sector. So they permitted the establishment of private universities. And now you see of the university, there are about 700 universities in the Arab world, and about 400 of them are private.
Private for profits, you mean?
Mostly, yes, mostly. But what that means is the universities that are, have American something about them are increasingly private for-profit institutions. So the American University in Sharjah is not. It's a not-for-profit, but it's owned and operated in a sense by the government. The American University in Dubai is a for-profit operation. The American University in Iraq, in Sulaymaniyah, is a private operation. So the meaning of American, or the association with American, is sort of, this is entree into a global job market, a global, perspective, and so forth and so on, which I think is largely correct, but it's in the context of a local, if you will, that is regional environment when maybe I should go to the German University in Cairo, which is one of these new operations, or the Japanese University of Egypt, they're also, so naming yourself after another place is a branding. You can get out of this country and into the world this way. It doesn't necessarily indicate quality of any one or another. It could be good, it could be bad, it's hard to tell. I would like to think that AUC is an excellent university, but surprisingly, perhaps to you, I actually think the American University in Dubai is okay. Not great, okay. For certain purposes, yes. So just being for profit doesn't mean you're terrible, which is for Americans who are not accustomed to for-profit education. That's an observation in itself. But it also means that for prospective students, for parents, it's just an unbelievably complicated, opaque, difficult to understand. Where do you want your children to go to school? If I tell you right now that some of the for-profits are serviceable, then you start thinking, well, maybe if my kids can't get into AUC, they'll go to AUD. So I do think that places a responsibility on places like this to really carve out the quality part as opposed to the American or global part, and to say what you get here, which I think is the case, what you get here is really an excellent education. And an excellent education in the 21st century includes access to the world. It includes being able to sort of see more broadly than you might have said an excellent education in the 1960s meant. Nowhere in the world was this sort of sense that exposure to the world was a valuable asset. That wasn't something we said in the 60s anywhere. You didn't say it in the United States, you didn't say it here. Now everybody believes that. But I do think that it's important to accent that side of things when you talk about here, for example. Because families, many families the children are first generation university. They're trying to figure out what they expect the university to do for their child, their student. They do tend to accent the sort of get a job as opposed to be a good citizen of your community and the other kinds of things we hope an education produces. So it's an interesting inflection point here as well. But it does mean that I think some of I hate to use this word having said it earlier, but some of the experiments that particularly Gulf countries are undertaking do have, as most experiments do, a lot riding on them.
Yeah.
It's important that this succeeds in terms of quality and excellence, because I think that will resonate through the rest of the higher ed landscape.
And value added to the host country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we got on to this, and naturally, given not only your interest and experience in this, but because of your role as a university leader for most of your career. But I want to bring it back to the declared sort of subject of the conversation tonight. We promised people politics and politics of the region. So let's move to that, and let's talk about some of the issues there. I mean, you've studied monarchies, authoritarianism. Tell us about what you're working on now, and what led you to want to work on this region. And when you look back at your body of work, what surprised you about sort of how it's evolved, and what has surprised you about how the politics of this region have changed over that period?
How long do you have? No, I'll start with again an anecdote that I think is telling both about me and about why I guess I've done what I've done. When I went to university in the United States, I was extremely parochial. I'd almost not been out of the country. And I thought I was going to be a civil rights lawyer. I knew of that as a profession. That was something one could do. And I took a course, and I hope there aren't that many lawyers in the room, but I took a course with a lawyer who was actually a retired practitioner. And it was my first year. And it was the most boring course I'd ever taken. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. So that was the end. So I was open to alternatives. And then I took another course called, and I kid you not, nobody would teach this course now, Politics and Culture and World Affairs. Everything about everywhere. And I loved it, but it was partly because I loved the instructor, who was a really charismatic woman, as it happened, which was still quite unusual. Anyway, she was a very authoritarian figure, and she assigned us what we were going to work on. It wasn't like we could pick anything. So she assigned papers, and she assigned me a paper on Egypt. Now, my life would have been completely different if she said Peru.
Wow.
Right? Because she assigned me a paper on Egypt, and this was, as it happened, well, I'll get to this. So anyway, I thought, this is interesting, and I went to a very small college. So I went off to the college library, and I read everything the college library had about Egypt. And this is supposed to be a 5 or 10 page paper, and I wrote like 60 pages. Wow. Everything there was to know about Egypt. And then I went home for Thanksgiving, and I was the world's authority on Egypt when Nasser died. So all of a sudden, expertise, so forth and so on, as I think college sophomore, or whatever I was. The point is, two things happened without my realizing. One, I said, I'm going to do this, that is to say, work on Egypt and the region as a whole and so forth and so on, until I get bored, and I have, which is to say, I never got bored. But it also made me realize how important teaching is. Because if she hadn't been my teacher, if she hadn't not only told me what to do, but then celebrated my 60-page first effort at learning something kind of thing, I never would have done what I've done. So I always go back to, that teacher, whatever teacher you had, you remember somebody who did that for you. So I sort of thought, if I had wanted to change the world by being a civil rights lawyer, I was going to change the world retail, one person at a time. And I still think education is absolutely crucial to the creation of whole human beings.
One person at a time.
One person at a time, which is why it's very hard to measure success.
Right.
Because if you're doing return on investment, it's hard to say one person at a time.
So then you studied Arabic, right?
Then I studied Arabic at Georgetown, Washington, obviously. And then I went to AUC and so forth and so on. Never really commanded the language, but that's okay. I did what I could. Always took solace in the fact that King Hussein had an Arabic tutor. And I figured if he had an Arabic tutor, it was okay. If I had an Arabic tutor. And then I was, doing graduate work and working on, in politics. I did a public policy degree before I went on for a PhD, which also tells you something about why I think this kind of education is interesting. But then I went to Columbia to get my PhD. And at the time, by then, there also had been the first Libyan I ever met was a graduate student, peer of mine. So he and I would have coffee, and he would tell me, this is where Tripoli, we'd look at the map, this is where Tripoli is, it's Benghazi. I mean, very simple stuff. And so I now went to the library, and unlike Egypt, there were 6 or 7 books in English about Libya. So I thought, well, if I write the next one, it's a contribution to the literature, even if it isn't very good. So it wasn't a matter of being confident about my capabilities.
There's nothing there. So anything you write is going to be...
Anything I write is going to be a contribution to the literature. And by then, Gaddafi had been in power for a reasonably long time in the United States, was quite unhappy with him. So I applied for fellowship money to do research in Libya. I didn't get any. So I applied again, and then the Social Science Research Council, which was not affiliated with the United States government, said, okay, Lisa, if you want to go ahead. So I ended up being the first and virtually the last, because the first American researcher to work in Libya, and I came back from that being virtually the only American who had spent time in Libya who was neither oil nor government. And the idea we had collectively, there was a new Center for Libyan Studies being established at the time, and we were going to build this sort of, history and politics center and, build the university landscape in Libya and so forth and so on. And obviously, for a variety of reasons, you're all familiar with that, fell apart. But I developed and because I wasn't sure I'd be able to work in Libya, I developed a research project which compared Libya and Tunisia, because I knew I could get a visa to Tunisia, and I wasn't sure I could get a visa to Libya. I should point out that both the Tunisians and the Libyans were offended by the comparison. But it worked out really well, because every once in a while you find a project which you ask questions, and because of the comparison, you see things you wouldn't see otherwise. So that was the book about Tunisia and Libya. That was the dissertation. And I learned so much in both those countries. I was reminiscing earlier today with some other people about how much I had learned by working with a particular Tunisian sociologist, not about my own research, but sort of about being a scholar. So that experience was spectacularly valuable to me. And then, of course, if you're careful, you manage a dissertation project, a research project, where you spend 6 months in, as it happens, 6 months in Libya, 8 months in Tunisia, and the rest in the archives of Europe. You have to go to Rome, you have to go to Paris, you have to go to London, because you're doing the archives of the colonial powers. So I urge you to think about where you might want to stay while you're doing whatever research you're doing. But Gaddafi was although while I was there, people around him said, did I want to meet him? And I said, well, it's not part of my research, but might be interesting. And they said, if you meet him, we'll never be able to talk to you again. So I said, okay, never mind. But he did do me a favor in other ways, because when I went out on the job market as a PhD in political science, lots of people interviewed me, not because they thought I would be a good hire, but because they'd never met anybody who'd been in Libya.
Really?
So my job talk was glamorous in the sense of, here's somebody who can tell us things about Libya that nobody else can tell us. Anyway, it worked. So my first job, much to the surprise of the department, was at Harvard. That's when I was an experiment. And there were several women hired.
Oh, that's when you were an experiment. Got it. Okay.
They had no women in their department.
Wow. So when you look back at that period and you look at how political dynamics have been shaped in the post-colonial Middle East, Arab world, what surprises you the most? What had you not anticipated
Well, actually, this is another useful, I think, story. During the, I would, as a political scientist, I said, and I published an article in the late 80s about the development of the state in the region. And you really saw governments that were committed to developing administrative capacity, some level of accountability to their populations. So whatever else you can say about, the Nasser revolution, it was to say that we're going to empower a larger proportion of Egyptians to be involved in the government of the country than just the king and the people around him and so forth. And you saw in lots of places those kinds of bureaucratic development, reaching out into rural areas, electrifying places, so forth and so on, a sort of classic state-led development. And when I wrote that article, said, this is uneven, this is not happening all the places, and in fact, it may be reversible. Look at Libya, because at that time, by then, it did seem like the Gaddafi regime was undermining bureaucratic capacity in the country, so it was clearly possible, but it didn't seem like very important. It seemed this was, the arc of history. Unfortunately, people still assign that article because I am about to publish something that says, boy, was that ever wrong. So, one, scholars should have the right and courage to say they were wrong. Voila. But you also, so why was I wrong? What was wrong about the assumption that this kind of development would continue? And I think there were a couple of things that happened. The most important was the consequences of the neoliberal revolution of the 1970s, Thatcher and Reagan and the Washington Consensus and Gorbachev, and everybody said big states are unsustainable. Therefore, everybody in the world who's trying to build a big state is making a mistake. So that meant that the wind in the sails of this effort to build states was beginning to diminish. How can you argue that Iraq should have a big state and Syria should have a big state and Egypt should have a big state when the IMF is saying you have to slim down, you can't afford this, you're not collecting taxes, and it's just the fiscal crisis the state is beginning to show. And so both ideologically and to some extent in terms of the economy of these states, it just wasn't sustainable. So then you get a period, in my estimation, where because the ruling bargain between regimes and people could no longer be a sort of a citizen has a right to these sorts of things. A citizen has a right to university education, things that, really weren't sustainable. So how do you continue to cement the relation? Rulers need supporters. You can't just rule because you want to, even though sometimes it seems like that. You need supporters. So you see what I think can be described as a sort of era of sectarianism, where rather than be the leader of a country, you increasingly behave like the leader of an ethnic group or a sect or something like that. That way you cement a relationship with people. They know you're supposed to serve them. You know who you're supposed to serve. But you've abandoned the idea of a kind of,
whole citizenry.
Yeah, whole citizenry. You can't afford it, so you're shrinking who you're accountable to, and you shrink it to your ethnic group. Or you see this in ethnic and tribal terms in Libya. You see it in sectarian terms in other, in the Arabs.
Syria.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sudan.
So you see all of these sort of ethnic sectarian conflicts beginning to develop as a result of that. And I think it is partly as a result of the shrinking of the state, because if you can't afford to be running a state, you have to be running something. And you have to have people who are willing to provide support to you of various kinds and so forth.
But it's patronage also,
Yeah,
right? In order to run the state, you need to have patronage.
Exactly. So rather than the relationship between, government and citizen, now you have, the patron and the client is identified. The eligible clients are co-religionists or kin or something like that. So you see that beginning to develop, and I think, I don't think we, as that began to develop, saw it quite in the way I'm describing it, but I think it's, in retrospect, pretty easy to see. You certainly saw the growth of sectarian, religious, ethnic kind of identities during this period. And then, then that model sort of runs out of steam, I would argue, by the time you get the Arab uprisings. Part of the reason it's running out of steam is the Americans have intervened in a variety of places quite dramatically. But it's also clear that the non-beneficiaries of these sorts of systems were getting unhappier and unhappier. Because, again, look at Tunisia. By the time you had the, uprising against Ben Ali, the clients he had was a tiny little circle around him, and everybody else in Tunisia felt left out.
Right.
So then you have that uprising. You have a few experiments like the Morsi regime and government in Egypt, where you think, well, maybe you could rule this way. But fairly quickly, and probably even before he came into office, there was a lot of skepticism that he was going to be sectarian is in an Egyptian sort of way, or he was going to privilege the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore disadvantage, obviously, everybody who's not Muslim in Egypt, but even people who are not Muslim Brotherhood. So people were worried about that. So that was a brief experiment, which in most people's estimation was a proof of concept that doesn't work anymore. So then what does work? Well, this is where we are now, and I think it is also tied to the growing influence of the Gulf. You see a model of government which is pretty well established in the Gulf and actually feasible here because of the wealth of the sub-region, which is basically government is business. So you see rulers describing themselves as the CEO of Dubai, or the CEO, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia is often described as the CEO, runs the sovereign wealth fund, so forth and so on. This is a business enterprise. It's like a family-owned business. And that conception of what the purpose of government and how it's supposed to operate, as I say, if most of the residents of the country are not citizens, they're employees, so they can be employees. So you can run this whole operation as a family-owned business with employees, with customers, with, and
there's the ruling family and the extended family.
Yeah, exactly. But if you have a family-owned business, you have all those kinds. And as you're well aware, family-owned business is the business model in the region. Almost all businesses are, in fact, family-owned businesses. So it's a familiar model. It makes sense. And so it's relatively easy to translate that model of an enterprise to government. It's familiar. People understand kind of how it works and so forth and so on. But it does mean that certain kinds of things are being done in a very different way, one of which is it's very hard to know. It's not hard to know when you have a small population and a lot of expat workers or labor. It is hard to know when you begin to translate that into places like Egypt, where what are you going to do with the 95 million Egyptians who are not actually part of a entrepreneurial group that can operate that way? But in the meantime, I do think that from a simultaneous sort of, this is a model of modernity. This is how exciting new projects are being understood on the one hand. This is how you develop now, is model it as a business investment make the case for it as a business investment. You're not doing this because you're bringing up citizens. You're going to have a return on this investment because people are going to be better educated, but they're also going to be entrepreneurs and so forth and so on.
And that's unique to the Gulf within the broader region.
Well, it's unique to the Gulf, yes, except the Gulf is so influential in the rest of the region.
Yes, I was going to ask you, so what is the implication geopolitically for the region? And the other night we were talking about how we're, years ago, the centers of gravity in the region were Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, and now it's Doha, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi.
Absolutely. And so this kind of model sort of goes along with financial underwriting of the Egyptian government after 2013. So they said, okay, we can give you a lot of money, but do the kinds of things we do, such as build a new city. Egypt really probably doesn't need a new administrative capital. It needs a lot of investment in the existing cities.
Right.
But that's not, the sort of build something new. That's a model that's really from the Gulf. It makes sense here. It doesn't necessarily, but it is being exported as a conception of how to think about, development and so forth and so on. And the final piece of this, which I think is also a particularly interesting element of it, is obviously the Gulf countries have very large sovereign wealth funds. Egypt has a sovereign wealth fund. The people who are advising Egypt on how to run their sovereign wealth fund are all the sovereign wealth fund folks from here. And what they're doing with the sovereign wealth funds now, when Kuwait established the Future Generations Fund, which was one of the first sovereign wealth funds in the world, they were extremely conservative investors. Now everybody's the private equity guy. They want to make a lot of money. So they're taking very risky investments by Kuwaiti old standards. So the sovereign wealth funds are, in fact, as with university endowments, doing quite well for some of the same sorts of reasons. Now, whether university endowments should be managed that way is an open question, and whether sovereign wealth funds should be managed that way is an open question. But in the meantime, it is further proliferating that sort of, we're in the world of business and finance. That's what we do. That's why we're successful, so forth and so on. And again, you can afford to do that when you have a cushion of a fair amount of pretty reliable hydrocarbon income. You can't really afford to do that in Egypt. And yet, the way they run their sovereign wealth fund is. So to me, what's interesting is that you have a number of countries who are, if you will, still mired in the debates about, sectarian and sort of ethnic and familial conflict. And then you have the countries that are really trying to sort of transcend that. And the way they're trying to transcend that is a very different model of government. So if I was to say, well, that's why I don't want people to assign that old article, because it doesn't have any of what actually happened later.
So you did say in a recent podcast, and I'll maybe make this one of my final couple of questions so that we can turn it to the audience, that the Middle East is being reshaped by the current situation, the war in Gaza, the Israel-Hamas war. How do you see it being reshaped? And we didn't really talk about sort of post the Arab Spring, well, over the past few years, before the current situation, the Abraham Accords.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that the Abraham Accords were a consistent expression of what I was just talking about.
Yeah.
We're about business. We're not about politics.
Right.
So if we can cut a profitable deal with Israeli business, fine. That's terrific. So it's a very transactional. Shouldn't surprise you that one of the midwives of all of this was Trump. Very transactional. But it's about business. If you can make money, that's good. And I think many of us worried that, as with what I just said about Egypt in a different context, there are 95 million Egyptians who are not in this world, what's going to happen to them? And similarly, there are however many Palestinians there are today who are not in that world. And it just wasn't sustainable. It just didn't feel sustainable. Yet, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration really put all their chips on this idea that you could run the region around a sort of conception of business relationships that somehow is going to trickle down and benefit everybody or something like that. Although, to their credit, none of the people who are involved in these relationships ever claimed that it was going to trickle down. So I think, such as there are any silver linings here, one of the silver linings of Gaza is that it has sort of blown that all out of the water. That's so clearly not a sustainable vision for the region. Jake Sullivan, this national security advisor, on October 1st, I think, published an article in Foreign Affairs saying about, American in the world and stuff. It said the Middle East had never been so peaceful.
Yeah.
I was like,
yeah,
wrong. But so I think it's, in that sense, it's salutary. It's sort of putting back on the table a bunch of things that need to be on the table. And one of the reasons why, to go back to this issue about why states didn't actually take hold as much as they might have, is in the absence of a Palestinian state, you have a constant reminder of the fragility of states and lots of people who cannot be attributed a government wherever they live. So in a way, I do think it's not the principal reason, but it is a substantial part of why the state building agenda sort of stalled and went off in different directions. So at this point, I think the politics are back, clearly back. What I worry about, for what it's worth, because I'm an American taxpayer, is I don't think anybody in the American foreign policy establishment who works on the Middle East understands this at all.
That's scary. Who do you think are the most influential people? I mean, you hear about McGurk having huge influence.
I'm going to say something kind of rude about somebody who keeps popping up all the time. He's basically retired. But it's amazing how quickly Dennis Ross reappears. Who, as those of you who know, is the architect of the peace process since George H.W. Bush. So when I'm being rude, and I will do it now because he's heard me say it, he's made a career out of failure. But he's back. Now, he's not in the central, but there isn't anyone with a new imagination. We're really running on fumes. This is a foreign policy establishment generation that just doesn't seem to be able to produce new ideas. So as with the turmoil in universities, I think this is going to be a turmoil. So I said that's really about who's in charge, and this is the, occasion for the debate. On the substance of American Middle East policy, I think there's going to be a lot of turmoil for quite a long time, because I really do think that the foreign policy elite has lost touch with the region.
But that turmoil is not, to what extent is that turmoil dependent on what's happening in Washington? And with that, actually, I'll ask my last question, and that is, what do you think the implications are of who is in the White House a year from now are going to be on how things evolve in the region, at least in the intermediate term?
Well, one of the things that's been striking to me, anyway, is the continuity between Trump and from Trump to Biden.
Right.
So, in some important ways, it's not clear that it matters very much. It matters in other realms. I think Biden has paid a lot more attention to kind of investment in domestic American infrastructure and some things that are really quite important. But in terms of foreign policy as a whole, but particularly policy here, there wasn't actually much of a difference. So I'm not sure how much of a difference the election makes. Except, interestingly, I think Biden is more susceptible to the widening of the conflict than Trump. I think Trump really, if he can't make money, let's
get out.
Let's get out. This isn't our problem with somebody. It's interesting, that kind of real transactional approach, he doesn't have much interest in, making a political point. Whereas the Biden administration, I think, still has some of that residual, we're the hegemon and you guys need to remember that Trump doesn't care. So either it won't make any difference, or if Trump is elected, it actually maybe is somewhat more modest. Wrong.